The early morning air in Seoul was thick with a damp, clinging chill that made every breath feel like a struggle. Tasha Reynolds ran, her professional black blazer flapping against her sides, her shoes pounding a frantic rhythm against the wet pavement. She did not look back, but she could hear him. Yoon Sang-min's heavier footsteps closing the distance, the sound of a man who believed he owned the ground she walked on. "Where do you think you're going?" Sang-min's voice cut through the quiet of 7 a.m. like a blade. Before she could reach the sanctuary of the building's side entrance, his hand clamped around her wrist, the grip so tight it felt as though her bones might snap. He dragged her back, spinning her around to face him. His gray blazer was rumpled, his expression a mask of toxic, familiar rage. "Leave me alone, Sang-min." Tasha's voice was sharp with a desperation she had tried for months to bury. She struggled, but the involuntary muscle memory of years of bracing for impact made her whole body pull tight from the soles of her feet upward. A black luxury car slowed beside them, the engine a low, predatory hum that seemed to vibrate in the pavement. Tasha barely noticed it until the back door opened and a man stepped directly into her path. She stopped short, the sudden presence of him acting like a physical barrier. Han Ji-hoon was tall, his dark suit perfectly pressed even at this hour, his neat hair undisturbed by the morning wind. He didn't look at Sang-min. His gaze went straight to the dark, swollen bruise on Tasha's cheek and stayed there. The silence he brought with him was absolute. He did not soften the moment with a reach or a comforting word. He simply gave her the complete, heavy space of his attention. "Who did that to your face?" Ji-hoon asked quietly. Tasha opened her mouth, but her throat was tight and her lungs were still burning from the run. She was standing in front of her employer, looking exactly like what she was, a woman who had been hit and had run here because here was the only direction she knew how to go. "She is my wife," Sang-min said, his voice shifting into a friendly, almost warm tone that Tasha knew was a lie. He kept his grip on her wrist, leaning toward Ji-hoon with the relaxed assessment of a man who had never encountered an obstacle he couldn't bully. "We had a disagreement this morning. Private matter. If you could give us a moment, I would appreciate it." Ji-hoon turned toward Sang-min. He did it slowly, the way a man turns when he has decided to give something his full and undivided focus. He looked at Sang-min's face, then at the hand still gripping Tasha's wrist, then back at his face again. "No," Ji-hoon said. Sang-min's jaw moved forward slightly, his pride beginning to flare. "Excuse me?" "She works for me," Ji-hoon said, his voice holding the specific calm of a man who never needed volume to make himself heard. "She is already late." Her face was not like that yesterday. Sang-min laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "I do not know who you are, but this does not concern you." "I know who you are," Ji-hoon replied. The laugh died instantly. Ji-hoon took one step toward Sang-min. Just one. He slid his hands into his trouser pockets, his expression not shifting by a single degree. The delivery rider at the nearby convenience store went still. The security guard at the lobby turned his head without moving the rest of his body. The world seemed to hold its breath. "If you touch her again," Ji-hoon said, his delivery as precise and literal as a death sentence, "you lose your hands." Sang-min stood very still. Something moved behind his eyes, a clear signal that his pride could not override. He looked at Tasha one final time, but she was already looking past him, focusing on the entrance of the building. One step back, then another, Sang-min straightened his jacket and walked away, his footsteps thinning into the noise of the waking city. Tasha stood on the pavement and finally breathed. Ji-hoon turned back to her, his eyes briefly touching the bruise again. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Get in the car," Ji-hoon said, gesturing to the open door where his driver, Young Do-won, watched with a serious, ready expression. "I will take you up." Before we move forward, let's welcome you to Afro-Korean Mafia Stories by SOBLESSED. Subscribe to be the first to see the latest video, like and share. Tell us where you are watching from in the comment box. See you. Thanks for watching. The interior of the car was the quietest place Tasha had been in a long time. The heavy door closed with a muffled, expensive thud, instantly reducing the chaotic noise of Seoul's morning traffic to a distant, irrelevant hum. It was a dark, leather-bound world that smelled faintly of cedar and cold air, a stark contrast to the humid, violent friction of the pavement she had just escaped. Ji-hoon sat on his side of the wide rear seat, maintaining a full, deliberate distance between them. He did not hover or offer the kind of frantic, suffocating sympathy that usually followed a scene of violence. Instead, he simply looked out his window at the city moving past, giving her the most precious commodity she could imagine, the right to be still. Tasha sat with her bag clutched in her lap, her hands folded tightly over the leather to hide their trembling. She could feel the heat radiating from the bruise on her cheek, a pulsing reminder of Sangmin's grip. Carefully, she pressed 2 fingers to her cheekbone, but the pain flared sharp and immediate, forcing her to drop her hand back to her bag with a small, sharp intake of breath. "Left panel," Ji-hoon said, his voice level and devoid of pity. "There is a first aid kit." She found it exactly where he said it would be, a small navy blue case tucked into the side compartment. Inside, she found a chemical ice pack. She snapped the inner seal, shaking it until it turned frost cold, and pressed it against her swelling skin. The relief was so sudden that she exhaled slowly through her nose, her shoulders finally dropping an inch from their defensive posture. From the corner of her eye, she saw Ji-hoon glance at her just once, a brief, assessing look that took in her state without demanding anything in return. Then he turned back to the window. It was a form of respect she hadn't felt in years, the respect of silence. With Sangmin, every silence had been a fuse, a ticking countdown to a question or an accusation. With Ji-hoon, the silence was a sanctuary. He didn't fill the air with empty reassurances or performative kindness. He simply allowed her to exist in the space next to him without having to explain her damage. The car glided toward the private side entrance of the high-rise building. As it came to a halt, Ji-hoon stepped out first and held the door for her. There was no ceremony in the gesture, no lingering touch or performance of gallantry. It was the practical act of a man whose hand was already on the door and who held it simply because she was coming through it. Tasha stepped out onto the forecourt, the ice pack still pressed to her face and her bag slung over her shoulder. The morning sun was beginning to break through the gray clouds, glinting off the glass of the tower. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words feeling heavy in the morning air. "For what happened back there?" Ji-hoon looked at her with a directness she was beginning to realize was his default setting. He didn't wave off the thanks, but he didn't dwell on it either. "Does he know where you live?" he asked, his tone shifting back to the pragmatic. "Yes," Tasha replied, a flicker of the old fear returning to her eyes. Ji-hoon nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and turned toward the entrance. As they walked toward the elevators, Tasha realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. The man walking beside her had a rhythm to his breathing that had no warning signal embedded in it, no hidden current of aggression. It was a steadiness she found herself leaning into, a sound so rare she had almost forgotten it existed. The elevator doors slid open at the 14th floor, revealing a hallway illuminated by the soft morning light. Caleb was already there, his small frame leaning forward with the vibrating impatience of a child who had been counting the seconds since he woke up. He wore his favorite pajamas, blue with small yellow stars, and his dark hair was sticking up in a stubborn tuft on the left side. "Mommy," he cried, his voice ringing through the quiet corridor. Tasha stepped out, and the impact of his small body hit her with the full, committed force of someone who is finally done waiting. She pressed her face into his hair, breathing in the scent of sleep and lavender soap, a warmth that was entirely and specifically his own. Caleb pulled back, his dark eyes moving over her face with a direct, unself-conscious attention that children have not yet learned to disguise. His brow drew together, looking far too old for his face, as he reached out a tiny finger toward her swollen cheek. "You have an oi," he said, his voice dropping into a grave whisper. "I bumped it, baby," Tasha said, her heart aching as she forced a small, reassuring smile. "It's fine." Caleb didn't look convinced. He turned his gaze to Ji-hoon, who stood just behind Tasha, watching the exchange with an expression that seemed to strip away the cold architecture of his public face. In this hallway, in the presence of the boy, something in Ji-hoon opened, something completely unguarded and soft. "Ji-hoon," Caleb said with the seriousness of a witness filing an official report. "Mommy has an oi on her face." "I see it," Ji-hoon replied, his voice shifting into a lower, gentler frequency. "Go get your things ready for breakfast. Let your mother put her bag down first." Caleb sighed with a touch of theatrical suffering but retreated toward the living room. A few minutes later, after Tasha had tended to her face in the staff room, she found the two of them at the low table near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Ji-hoon was sitting in an armchair, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching Caleb work with a set of crayons. Caleb was hunched over a fresh sheet of paper, his tongue poking out in concentration. He produced 4 drawings in careful sequence, laying them out on the table with the gravity of a medical prescription. "This one is for making the oi feel better," Caleb announced, sliding a drawing of a smiling yellow sun toward Tasha. "And this one is because everyone needs a nice house." He placed a house with a blue door beside it. Tasha sat on the floor beside him, her fingers tracing the waxy lines of the crayon. "They're beautiful, Caleb. Thank you." "Wait," Caleb said, his small hands moving with renewed energy. He pulled a final sheet of paper toward him, scribbling with intense focus. When he finished, he held it up for both of them to see. It featured 3 figures standing in a line. There was a tall, sharp-shouldered figure in a black suit, a woman with long braids and a star above her head, and a smaller figure with a dramatically large head and an even larger star. Caleb pointed to each one in turn. "That's you, and that's Ji-hoon, and that's me." He looked up at them with complete, serene expectation. "This is our family." The air in the room seemed to change temperature. Tasha felt something pull tight in the center of her chest, a sensation that had been building for months in small, quiet increments. Beside her, Ji-hoon went perfectly still. He did not look away from the drawing, and for a moment, the silence was so heavy she could hear the Han River moving in the distance outside. He looked at the tall figure in the drawing, then at Tasha, and then at Caleb. The corner of his mouth shifted by the smallest, most controlled degree. It wasn't a smile yet, but it was an acknowledgement of a truth that neither of them was prepared to examine out loud. "It is a very thorough drawing, Caleb," Ji-hoon said, his voice low and steady. "I know," Caleb said, already reaching for a green crayon to add grass to the bottom of the page. Tasha looked at the 3 stars in the drawing and then at the man sitting across from her. She realized then that the silence between them had transformed again. It was no longer just a sanctuary from the past, but a bridge toward something they were both starting to recognize. That night, the city of Seoul settled into its permanent low frequency, but for Han Ji-hoon, the silence was a thin veil. He woke at 3 o'clock in the morning, his skin humming with the residual warmth of a dream that had pursued him for 3 years. He lay on his back in the dark, staring at the ceiling, letting the feeling of it pass through him like water through a hand. He never chased the specifics of these dreams. He had learned that following the thread only led to a door that would not open. There was never a clear face or an identifiable place, yet the recognition existed at a level below thought. It was always the same, the weight of a hand in his, a voice he knew by heart, and a presence that felt like the only home he had ever truly understood. He got up and moved through the quiet apartment to the kitchen, where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the Han River moving in the distance. He found Tasha there, standing at the counter with a glass of water, her eyes fixed on the lights of the city below. The moonlight caught the thin gold chain at her throat, the crescent pendant resting against her collarbone as she breathed. "You're awake," she said softly, not turning around. "The dream," he replied, his voice a low vibration in the still air. He leaned back against the counter, watching the way she held her glass with both hands, a habit he had begun to file away in his mind alongside 1,000 other small observations. "I've had it every few nights for 3 years. Since before Caleb was brought to me." Tasha went still, her fingers tightening slightly around the glass. What happens in it? Nothing that makes sense to a conscious mind, Ji-hoon said, looking out at the towers on the opposite bank. I am standing in a place I don't recognize, and someone is beside me. I can never see her face. The light is always behind her, or the fog is too thick, or I wake up just as she begins to turn. He paused, the memory of the dream's warmth still sitting in his chest. But I can see her hand. I can feel the weight of it in mine. And I know her voice. It's a sound that tells me I am no longer alone, even if I can't find the person it belongs to. Tasha finally turned to face him. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a deep purple, and her expression was guarded, yet there was a flicker of something raw in her eyes, a look of recognition that mirrored his own. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because today, when Caleb showed us that drawing, for the first time in 3 years, the dream felt like a memory instead of a haunting," Ji-hoon said, his gaze dropping to the pendant at her throat. He didn't reach for her, but the distance between them felt charged, as if the air itself had changed temperature. "I've spent years grieving a woman I was told was dead, and yet I wake up reaching for a hand that feels as real as the glass you're holding." He watched her throat move as she swallowed, her hand moving instinctively toward the necklace. She looked as though she wanted to speak, to bridge the gap between them with words she had been rehearsing in the dark for 8 months. But the silence held, heavy and full of things that could not yet be unburied. "Go back to sleep, Tasha," he said quietly, picking up his own glass. "The sun will be up in 4 hours. Caleb will want to show you the park tomorrow." He walked back to his room, but as he closed the door, he knew the thread had finally been caught. The dream no longer ended at an unopened door. It ended with the silhouette of a woman standing in his kitchen, wearing a crescent made of gold that he had sketched with his own hand 11 years ago. The Tuesday afternoon air was brittle with a sudden, biting wind that carried the scent of coming rain. Tasha stepped into the small convenience store 2 streets away from the apartment, the bell above the door chiming with a cheerful indifference to the knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She moved down the narrow aisle toward the back, searching for the specific grape juice Caleb had decided was the only acceptable drink for his afternoon snack. She was reaching for the last bottle on the shelf when the air behind her shifted. It was a change in pressure she had learned to recognize across 9 years of hypervigilance, the heavy, familiar presence of a man who moved as if the space around him was his to claim. "You have me blocked on every number, Tasha," Sangmin said, his voice low and conversational, as if they were 2 strangers discussing the merits of the juice in front of them. Tasha's hand froze on the glass bottle. She did not turn around. "Leave me alone, Sangmin." "That is a childish way to handle things," he replied, moving closer until his shoulder brushed hers. The pleasantness in his tone was the most dangerous thing about him, the low sky that always preceded the storm. "You embarrass me in front of that man. You let him talk to me like I was nothing." "I need you to go," Tasha said, finally grasping the bottle and trying to move toward the counter. Sangmin's hand closed around her wrist. It wasn't violent yet, just firm, a silent communication that she was not going anywhere until he decided she was. The convenience store attendant at the front was looking at his phone, oblivious to the silent struggle in the back aisle. "Think carefully about what you're doing," Sangmin whispered, his grip tightening just enough to make the skin white around his fingers. Then, the bell at the entrance chimed again. Tasha looked up and saw Young Do-won, Ji-hoon's primary bodyguard, walking through the door. He was a man of broad, solid build, his eyes possessing the careful, unblinking quality of someone who spent his professional life watching the world without being watched back. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply walked toward the back of the store with a smooth, economical gait that suggested he had done this kind of thing 1,000 times before. Sangmin released her wrist before Do-won was even halfway down the aisle. He stepped back, a practiced, charming smile spreading across his face, as if they had just been sharing a joke. "I'll see you tomorrow, Tasha," Sangmin said, his voice still pleasant, though something cold moved behind his eyes as he walked past the bodyguard and out into the street. Tasha stood at the counter, her wrist pressed against her stomach, the pulse in her neck erratic and sharp. Do-won stopped beside her, his presence as immovable as a mountain. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer a hand to study her. He simply looked at the red marks beginning to bloom on her skin, and then at the door through which Sang-min had vanished. "He touched you?" Do-won asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "My wrist," Tasha managed to say, her fingers trembling as she handed the juice to the attendant. He wouldn't let go." Do-won took out his phone, his thumb moving quickly over the screen. "Mr. Han will want to know about this." Tasha didn't argue. She paid for the juice and walked out of the store, flanked by the man who represented the absolute authority of the Han organization. As she climbed into the back of the car, she realized the shadow that had followed her since her return to Seoul was no longer just her burden to carry. Ji-hoon was watching, and for the first time, the quietest place wasn't just inside the car. It was the knowledge that someone else was running the calculation of her safety. The following Wednesday morning, the kitchen was held in an ordinary silence, the city of Seoul sprawling beyond the window in a hazy gray light. Ji-hoon stood at the counter with his coffee, his gaze fixed on the Han River, while Tasha continued cutting fruit for Caleb's breakfast. The routine was familiar, yet the air between them had grown dense with unspoken questions since their conversation in the moonlight. "Caleb was asking me something last night," Ji-hoon said, his voice breaking the quiet without turning around. Tasha's knife continued its steady rhythm against the cutting board. "He wanted to know about your necklace. Why you wear it every day." Tasha's hand slowed by a fraction of a second. She kept her eyes on the fruit, her fingers instinctively brushing the gold pendant at her throat. "What did you tell him?" "I told him some things matter enough to keep close," Ji-hoon said. He turned then, leaning back against the counter with his cup held in both hands, his eyes moving openly and directly to the crescent at her collarbone. He did not pretend to look at anything else. "What is it?" "The pendant." Tasha looked down at the gold briefly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "A crescent," she said, her voice nearly steady. "I bought it at a market years ago. Cape Town." "Which market?" Ji-hoon asked. Tasha looked up at him, finding his face composed, still, and completely unreadable. "One of the outdoor ones near the waterfront. I don't remember exactly which one." Ji-hoon held her gaze for a long moment, a silence stretching between them that felt like a bridge narrowing. Then he nodded once, picked up his coffee, and walked toward his study. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. Tasha stood at the cutting board with a knife in her hand, unable to move for 3 full seconds. She turned the pendant over with her free hand, her thumb tracing the small, precise engraving on the back, 2 letters intertwined that were impossible to read unless you already knew they were there. Inside his study, Ji-hoon did not open a single document. He sat at his desk, staring at the wall, his mind retreating 11 years into the past. He remembered a jeweler in Insadong, a man who worked only on private commissions and had studied a sketch from Ji-hoon's own hand for a long time before agreeing to the work. The crescent shape had been specific, the curve, the weight, the way the chain connected at the upper point rather than the lower. He remembered watching the man use a tool smaller than a pen under a magnifying glass to cut those 2 letters into the gold. It was meant to be the only one of its kind in existence. Ji-hoon picked up his phone and sent a message to Do-won. "I need the name of the jeweler in Insadong who does private commissions. The one I used 11 years ago. Find him." He set the phone down, but the image of the pendant resting against Tasha's skin remained at the front of his mind. If the necklace was what he thought it was, then the woman standing in his kitchen was not just a professional assistant who had survived an abusive ex-husband. She was the living ghost of the only woman he had ever intended to marry. He sat in the quiet, the weight of the truth beginning to settle, understanding that the calculation he had been running for 8 months was about to return a result that would change everything. Saturday arrived with clear, high skies and the mild air of early spring, an invitation that Caleb accepted with the focused energy of someone who had been preparing for this operation for days. They walked to the park together, the boy positioned between them, narrating the world with an unstoppable, cheerful efficiency. He pointed out a man doing slow exercises near the gate and 2 pigeons that he assessed with the critical eye of a documentarian. The park was alive with the low, permanent frequency of the city, but the small group moved within their own private pocket of quiet. Within minutes, a large, gentle dog appeared on the path. Caleb crouched immediately, greeting the animal with the solemn formality of an important diplomatic meeting. Tasha knelt beside him, her hand ready to steady the boy if he pitched forward in his enthusiasm. Ji-hoon stood just behind them, his hands in his pockets, his gaze resting on the back of Tasha's neck. She had pinned her hair up to combat the warmth of the morning, exposing the nape of her neck fully for the first time. At the base of her hairline, on the right side, there was a small, irregular mark, a permanent birthmark, darker than the surrounding skin. It was a detail so specific, so private, that it belonged only to the memory of the woman he had lost. He looked at it for 2 full seconds, then looked away, his pulse quickening with a sudden, sharp clarity. He looked back again, and something moved through him that he could not locate or name. It was more like standing in the dark and feeling the temperature of the room change without warning. He was certain then that the air around him had shifted, that the woman kneeling in the grass was the answer to every question he had been afraid to ask. Caleb stood up suddenly, grabbing both their hands at once, his right hand finding Tasha's left, his left hand finding his father's, and pulled them toward the fountain. Ji-hoon walked because his son was pulling him, and because standing still would require an explanation he did not yet have the strength to give. When they reached the water, Caleb released them and ran the last few meters to the edge. Tasha and Ji-hoon stopped side by side, brought together by the natural physics of the moment. The sound of the falling water was loud between them, the mild autumn air moving in soft currents around them. Ji-hoon looked at her profile, the way her head tilted slightly as she watched Caleb, the small curve at the corner of her mouth. The gold pendant rested at her collarbone, catching the spring light every time she breathed. He looked at the necklace, then at her profile, then back at the pendant. "Appa, do you have a coin?" Caleb called from the fountain. Ji-hoon reached into his pocket without looking away from Tasha for a single moment longer. He felt the weight of 9 years sitting in the space between them, a burden that was suddenly, miraculously, beginning to lift. He walked forward and placed the coin in his son's outstretched hand, but his mind was already miles away, back in a clinic in South Africa and a coastal road in Busan, piecing together the wreckage of a life he was no longer willing to leave in the dark. The files from Director O arrived on a Monday morning, 2 weeks after Ji-hoon had made the initial call. He sat alone at his desk before the apartment had fully stirred, the heavy silence of the study pressing in as he opened the folder. He read the original accident report from the coastal road outside Busan first, the 3-page document that had been compressed into a single, official page of lies. The missing pages contained a witness statement from a driver who had seen a second vehicle deliberately accelerate into the first car on a stretch of road with no cameras and no barriers. The report noted that the officer who signed the original had retired 6 months later on a pension that no man of his rank could have earned honestly. Ji-hoon felt the air in his lungs turn cold. It was not a drifting car or a wet road. It was a calculated execution. He turned to the medical files from the private clinic in South Africa. The patient had been admitted 9 days after the Busan accident, unconscious and without identification. The transport and care had been paid for through shell accounts that traced back through 20 years of his family's private financial channels his father had controlled with absolute authority. The surgical notes described 3 procedures over 14 months, recreating a face that shared no visible features with the woman he had loved. But it was the obstetric notes, clipped separately to the back, that made the world go quiet. Tasha had been 14 weeks pregnant at the time of the accident. She had not told him yet. The pregnancy had been monitored throughout her recovery, and the delivery of a healthy boy, 3.2 kilograms, had taken place 7 months after her admission. The line below the delivery notes burned into his vision. Infant transferred to private transport arranged by third party on day 4 postpartum. Patient was under sedation for post-surgical procedure at time of transfer. Patient was not consulted. Ji-hoon read that line 3 times. His father, or someone acting directly for him, had been waiting in that clinic like a vulture. They had waited until she was drugged and helpless to steal his son and put him on a plane to Seoul. Ji-hoon remembered the evening 3 weeks later when Do-won had knocked on his door to tell him a representative was downstairs with something that belonged to him. He remembered his father telling him that the woman was gone, that the child was all he had left, and that the family would handle the rest. He had believed the lie because he was grieving and the baby was real and warm in his arms. He had raised Caleb for years, never knowing that Tasha had woken up in a foreign clinic to find her body rebuilt and her child vanished. She had survived a murder attempt and the theft of her soul, only to come back and watch him from the kitchen, waiting to see if he was the monster his father had proven to be. Ji-hoon closed the file and placed both hands flat on the desk, breathing very carefully for a long time. The betrayal was a jagged thing, cutting through the foundations of his life. Outside the study, he could hear the normal morning sounds of the apartment, Caleb's laughter, the clink of a spoon against a bowl. It was a stolen life, built on the wreckage of a woman who was currently preparing his son's breakfast. He stood up, the weight of the folders in his hand, knowing that the time for watching was over. Ji-hoon did not use his hands to settle the debt that night. He used his signature. He had known for weeks that Yoon Sang-min worked at a mid-sized import logistics firm, and he had spent that time tracing the corporate vines upward until he found the root. The firm was a subsidiary of a holding group in which Ji-hoon owned 38% and held 2 dominant board seats. He had not touched this information until Sang-min put his hands on Tasha in the convenience store, but now, the calculation was complete. He arrived at the office building in Udo at 8:15 p.m., a time when the firm's ambitious middle management still sat under the hum of fluorescent lights. Sang-min was at his desk when the receptionist, her voice tight with the sudden arrival of an unannounced owner, showed him to the small conference room near the elevator bank. Sang-min walked in expecting a late-night client meeting, but he stopped short when he saw Ji-hoon sitting at the head of the table. Ji-hoon did not rise. He sat with a single folder in front of him, his hands folded on top of it, wearing the expression of a man who had arrived somewhere he was always destined to be. He watched Sang-min take in the room, the closed door, and the silent authority of the man across from him. "You know who I am?" Ji-hoon said. It was a statement, not a question. "You're the man from the pavement," Sang-min said, his voice cautious, but still carrying the remnants of his loud, hollow pride. "I am Han Ji-hoon," he replied. He opened the folder and turned the top document so Sang-min could read it. "I own 38% of the holding group that oversees your employer. Every salary deposit you have received for 2 years came from a payroll system that exists within my ownership structure." The color did not leave Sang-min's face all at once. It went slowly, the way something expensive breaks in stages. He looked at the document, his jaw working as he realized the magnitude of the cliff he had just walked over. "Your contract contains a standard conduct clause," Ji-hoon continued in the same even tone he used for negotiations and death threats alike. "I had my legal team review your file this afternoon. You are in breach. Your access card will be deactivated at midnight, and a termination letter will be processed by HR tomorrow morning. You will not be eligible for a reference." "You cannot do this," Sang-min stammered, his hands beginning to shake. "I already have," Ji-hoon said. He stood up, the motion smooth and final. He looked at Sang-min one last time, his gaze as cold as the coastal water in Busan. "She told you to leave her alone. You put your hand on her wrist today, anyway." He held the look for 2 seconds, letting the silence do the work of a physical blow. "If you make contact with her again, through any channel, in any form, the legal file my team has prepared goes to the prosecutor's office. I have the medical records and the testimony from your previous partners. You deserve exactly what is coming." Ji-hoon walked to the door and left without looking back. He drove back across the river, understanding that while he had erased Sang-min from Tasha's future, the hardest confrontation, the one involving the truth of their past, was still waiting for him in the quiet of his own home. The rain came in the early evening without warning, a heavy, committed autumn downpour that drove against the windows of the 14th floor in continuous gray sheets. It turned the world outside into a blurred landscape of water and light, sealing the apartment into a pressurized silence. Tasha stood at the kitchen counter, her hands wrapped around a glass of water, watching the Han River disappear behind the deluge. The air in the kitchen changed before she heard him move. Ji-hoon appeared in the doorway, his presence no longer the controlled, professional mask he wore for the world, but something stripped of management. He did not stay at the entrance. He walked into the room and stopped 3 feet from her, closer than the usual distance they had maintained for 8 months. "Tell me about the accident," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pull at the very air between them. "The coastal road outside Busan. 9 years ago, October." Tasha's hand pressed flat against the counter, her knuckles white. The kitchen was so quiet, she could hear the rhythmic hum of Caleb's program playing down the hall. She had rehearsed this moment in her head for 8 months, but the actual weight of his gaze, deep, focused, and seeing past the surface of things, made the rehearsals feel like paper in a storm. "Ji-hoon," she said. The sound of his name in her mouth caused a fractional shift in his face, a tightening of his jaw that spoke of a recognition he could no longer deny. "How long?" he asked, his voice level but strained. "How long have you been in this apartment knowing who I am?" 8 months, she replied, finally meeting his eyes. "I found the agency. I arranged the interview. I came back to Seoul for Caleb." Ji-hoon turned away from her, his back to the room as he faced the window. His hands were flat on the counter, his shoulder blades tight under his jacket with a tension he couldn't fully hide. The rain continued its assault on the glass as Tasha told him everything. The car that had accelerated deliberately into her on that wet road, the impact that sent her into the dark, freezing water, and the long darkness that followed. She told him about waking up in Cape Town with her face and hands wrapped in bandages, clutching the gold necklace so tightly her fingers had to be pried away. She told him how the surgeon had warned her that when the reconstruction was finished, no one who had known her would recognize her again. "She told me you were dead," Ji-hoon said, his voice so controlled it was more terrifying than a shout. "My father stood in front of me and watched me grieve you for years." "I know," Tasha said softly. "I watched you for 8 months because I didn't know if you were part of what they had done. I couldn't afford to be wrong." Ji-hoon turned back to her, his expression raw, the management completely gone. He looked at her face, really looked at it, the way he had been rationing his attention for months because he hadn't trusted what it would show him. "I need you to tell me the truth," he said, his hand coming up slowly to touch the pendant at her throat. He turned the gold over, his thumb moving over the engraving he had watched a jeweler cut 11 years ago. "Not the market in Cape Town. The truth." Tasha looked at him for a long time, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm against the glass behind them. She took a breath, letting the name she had buried for 9 years finally surface. "Nality," she said. Ji-hoon closed his eyes, his forehead coming to rest against hers as the 9 years they had lost sat in the kitchen with them. The rain drove against the windows of the 14th floor, but inside the warm kitchen, the silence had finally broken, replaced by the steady, almost controlled beat of a heart that had found its way home. Ji-hoon drove to Hanamdong alone. He did not call ahead, arriving at the ancestral family estate at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He walked through the front door without ringing and found his father in the formal receiving room, a space of high-backed chairs and controlled lighting that had been used to dictate family terms for decades. His father sat with tea and a document, composed and unsurprised, wearing the expression of a man who had prepared for this inevitable collision. Ji-hoon sat down across from him and placed the heavy folder from Director O on the table. "Read it," he said. His father did not touch the folder immediately, but Ji-hoon's voice remained level, a precision more final than any shout. His father eventually opened the file, reading the accident report, the South African hospital records, and the delivery note that stated the patient was not consulted when the infant was taken. When his father closed the folder, his expression remained trained and unbetraying. "Everything I did," he said, echoing the cold logic of the syndicate, "I did for this family." Ji-hoon looked at him across the table for a long moment. "You tried to kill her," he said. "You paid someone to run her off a coastal road. You arranged for her to be rebuilt surgically so she could never return. You waited until she was sedated to take her child. He paused, his voice steady even as he felt the weight of 9 years of grief. And then you stood in front of me and told me she was dead while you watched me raise that child alone. His father's composure held. She was not suitable, he replied, as if that explained away the blood on his hands. I am going to stop you there, Ji-hoon said, his tone as sharp and final as a blade. He opened a second, thinner folder, a domestic document that did not require a director's investigation to produce. A criminal submission has already been filed with the prosecutor's office. Attempted murder, criminal conspiracy, and the payment trail connecting your accounts to the clinic in Cape Town are all included. His father looked at the folder, the first sign of a crack appearing at the edges of his calm. As of 9 this morning, Ji-hoon continued, you have been removed from every position you hold in the family's business operations. Every account, every contact, every board seat. You have no access to any of it. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze pinning the older man to his seat. The Hannum property will be monitored by a security detail starting today. They are not there for your protection. They are there to enforce your exile. You are taking everything, his father said, his voice still composed but hollowed out, the sound of a man watching his currency disappear. You took everything from her first, Ji-hoon replied as he stood up and straightened his jacket. I will not be coming here again. Caleb will not be coming here. When he is old enough, he will know the full truth of what you did, and he will decide for himself if he wants to know you. I will make certain of that. He picked up both folders and walked out of the room, leaving his father in the silence of the house he had turned into a prison. As Ji-hoon drove back across the river toward the apartment where Tasha and Caleb waited, he felt the heavy architecture of the Han organization shifting. The old world was gone, and for the first time, he was driving home to a family that was no longer a lie. The following Tuesday evening, the apartment was held in a deep, settled quiet. Caleb was finally asleep, the door to his room ajar just enough to let a sliver of light fall across the hallway. The heavy autumn rain had passed, leaving only the reflection of the city's lights shimmering against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Tasha sat at the low table near the glass, a book open in front of her, though her eyes were fixed on the Han River moving in the darkness. The gold necklace remained at her throat, catching the warm circle of light from the lamp. Ji-hoon came out of his study, his steps silent on the hardwood floor. He did not go to the kitchen or the window. Instead, he walked directly to the low table and sat across from her. He placed a small, dark box on the wood between them and folded his hands, his gaze meeting hers with a directness that required no management. Tasha looked at the box, then up at him, her breath hitching in the still air. I had a ring made once before, Ji-hoon said, his voice low and steady. I lost it when I lost you. I had another one made 8 weeks ago, long before I had the files from Director O in my hand. He looked at her with the full knowledge of everything they had survived. I am not going to reconstruct the speech I prepared 11 years ago. I am not the same person who wrote it, and you are not the same person it was intended for. He reached out, his hand resting near the box but not yet touching it. But I am the same person who chose you then, and I am choosing you now, with the full knowledge of what choosing you cost, and what it will continue to cost. I have no interest in choosing differently. Tasha's fingers trembled as she reached for the box and opened it. The ring inside was simple and exact, a band of gold that caught the lamplight. When she turned it slightly, she saw the engraving on the inner band, the same 2 intertwined letters that were cut into the back of her pendant. It was the final piece of a broken history, made whole again. She looked up at him, her eyes burning with a heat that was not from the lamp. Yes, she said, her voice a soft, certain vibration in the quiet room. Obviously, yes. Ji-hoon took the ring from the box and took her hand. His touch was careful, cupping her fingers as though she was something that had survived a great deal and deserved to be handled with the full knowledge of that weight. He slid the ring onto her finger, and for a moment, they both simply looked at it, the gold marking the end of her life as Penelope and the beginning of their life as a family. Mommy? Water. Caleb's sleepy voice drifted from down the hallway, breaking the gravity of the moment. Ji-hoon looked at Tasha, and she saw him press his lips together to keep a smile contained. He stood up, the movement fluid and natural, and walked toward his son's room. Tasha sat at the low table with the ring on her finger, listening to the quiet sound of Ji-hoon getting Caleb water and the low, murmuring rhythm of their voices. She held the pendant between her thumb and forefinger. The piece of gold she had carried through 3 surgeries, 2 names, and 9 years of exile. She understood then what the necklace had been carrying her toward all along. It had been pointing here, to this table and this silence, to a life that had finally earned the peace it was about to deliver. The spring light arrived in a soft, golden wash over the private garden outside the city, where 30 people, the only ones who knew the complete, unvarnished truth of the story, had gathered to witness the end of a long exile. There was no public fanfare, no corporate posturing, just the stubborn, improbable insistence of a family that had found its way back to the same place despite the distance and the damage the world had put between them. Caleb led the way down the garden path, wearing a miniature black suit that mirrored Ji-hoon's. He carried a basket of petals with the extreme precision of a senior researcher, pausing twice to redistribute them where he felt the coverage was inadequate. He approached this responsibility with a gravity that suggested he had been waiting his whole life to do exactly this, ensuring every inch of the path was ready for his mother. Tasha, now known to everyone by her real name, Nality, came down the path with the gold necklace catching the dappled sunlight at her throat. She did not wear a mask of professional competence or a disguise of fear. She walked with her head held high, the reconstruction of her face finally matching the peace in her spirit. Ji-hoon stood at the end of the path with his hands at his sides, his face completely and entirely unmanaged. There was no professional distance in his eyes, no controlled architecture to protect his thoughts from the world. It was simply the face of a man watching a woman who had survived everything intended to destroy her and had come back to him anyway. "Nality," he said as she reached him, his voice a quiet vibration intended only for her. He spoke her name with a specific, internal sound that no one else had ever been able to produce, giving it back to her with everything it had ever contained. "Han Ji-hoon," she whispered back, her smile breaking through with a warmth that radiated outward in every direction. They said their words to each other under the budding trees, and every single word was true. As the ceremony concluded, Caleb finished his petal distribution and stepped forward, reaching for both their hands at the same moment, his right hand finding his mother's, his left finding his father's, and pulled them forward into the next chapter of their lives. 18 months later, that same garden would see Caleb sitting on the grass, studying the face of a new sibling with the careful attention of a scientist encountering new data. He would decide the baby didn't do very much yet, while Nality and Ji-hoon watched from the nearby bench, their lives finally settled into a permanent, ordinary shape. Every year of what had been survived was visible in the way they looked at one another, a complete, absolute knowledge of what they had built and exactly what it had cost. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the necklace sat on the nightstand back at the apartment, its work finally finished. Every surgery, every document, and every mile had always been pointing here. And in the quiet of the garden, as the city moved at its permanent low frequency in the distance, they were exactly where they were supposed to be.